Active Directory Alternative Authentication Schemes by Joe Squillace. Presentation Overview. During this presentation, we'll go over the following topics. What is Active Directory and what is authentication? How does authentication work? Active Directory authentication versus authorization. Active Directory authentication means and methods available. Things to consider when choosing an alternative Active Directory authentication system. What are the alternative Active Directory authentication methods available today? We'll look at the pros and cons of an alternative Active Directory authentication system. We'll look at the most widely used alternate Active Directory authentication system. Look at some recommendations for implementing an alternative Active Directory authentication system into your facility. And we'll look at some companies that offer alternative Active Directory authentication solution systems. So what is Active Directory and what is authentication? Active Directory is a directory service that's included with most Microsoft Windows server operating systems, and it serves as a central location for network security, network administration command, and management control of resources for administrators and management personnel. Through the security function, Active Directory is responsible for authenticating and authorizing all users and computers that will be accessing protected and secured resources within or on the domain. Authentication is the process of verifying that the user actually is who they say or claim to be, and Active Directory is responsible for this task. Active Directory uses the Kerberos authentication protocol to authenticate users. They use a domain controller running the Key Distribution Center, or the KDC, and allow computers to exchange tickets over the network instead of passwords. They also use long-term keys that are exchanged between security principals and the Key Distribution Center. So how does authentication work? When a user or system attempts to gain access to a network, they are required to input some form of credentials that contain some combination of a username and password. Once a user has input their credentials, the system then compares the credentials that the user input with a master list in the database that contains acceptable username and password combinations. If the username and password that was entered is an acceptable match, then the user or system is granted initial access to the network. However, the user is momentarily limited in what resources they can access until an authorization check has been performed. This authorization check will validate which network resources that specific security principal can access by checking the access control list. Active Directory authentication versus authorization. Active Directory authentication is the process of determining whether or not someone or something is who or what they are claiming to be. Authentication usually involves some combination of a username and a password that needs to be verified before being granted access to a computer, network, domain, etc. Active Directory authorization, on the other hand, is the process of determining which permissions a user or system has been granted and what resources they are permitted to access based on those permissions. Once a user or system has been authenticated and granted initial access to the system, the computer will then evaluate the level of access the security principal should be granted based on the access control list and the access control entry associated with that particular resource and/or security principal. Active Directory authentication means and methods. Means of authentication are usually grouped into three categories. 1. Something a user knows, typically a username and a password. 2. Something a user has, typically a key card or a smart card, USB token, something like that. And 3. Something a user is. This is some form of physical characteristic of the user in the form of a biometric. Methods of authentication. Kerberos, which is a centralized authentication method, uses a ticket-based system that uses a cryptographic key or a long-term key and tickets that are exchanged between security principals and the key distribution center. CHAP, Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, is a three-way handshake authentication system that is used with dial-up connections. And multi-factor authentication, which is the act of authenticating a user based on a combination of more than one authentication method. There are several other alternative authentication methods that can be used instead or with Active Directory as well. Some things to consider when choosing an alternative Active Directory authentication system as an alternate. What operating system will be used with the alternative solution? Windows, Mac, Linux, etc. What is the cost of implementing the new alternative solution into your current network or system? The initial cost of devices, license fees, training costs, software, etc. What is the cost of replacing different components of the alternative solution if something happens? Example, replacement devices, cost of batteries, reissuing of authentication codes, damage, theft, etc. Are there a variety of options and methods available to implement a multi-factor authentication system across your current system platform? And what type of continued support will your company need with this new system? Will there be additional training requirements and continued coordination with product agents or clients? These are important things to consider. Let's look at some alternative Active Directory authentication methods that are available today. Biometrics is based on data that does not change over a person's lifetime. The use of biometrics includes something that a person is as part of the login authentication procedure for a user to access a workstation or server. Some forms of examples of biometric solutions include facial recognition, hand geometry, fingerprint ID, iris and retina scan, signature, and voice and speech. Smart cards, which are fully supported in Microsoft Windows Server 2008, are also used as an authentication medium in place of or in combination with passwords. They use the RSA key, and a smart card reader is required. RSA is a public key encryption algorithm that's used in authentication systems. And you have portable USB devices. These are readerless smart card devices that store the authentication information on the device itself. Let's look at the pros and cons of the alternative Active Directory authentication systems. First, biometrics. With facial recognition, they can be matched quickly, and facial features do not change over a lifetime. However, there is only a 90% success rate of a match, which means there's a 10% failure rate. They can be tricked by other images, and they seem to favor men to women. With hand geometry, this is very simple and easy to use and unobtrusive to the end user. However, they're not unique to individuals, and certain jewelry can pose challenges to the software. With fingerprint ID, this is a cheap to install system. Attackers cannot guess a fingerprint, and a user cannot forget or lose their finger. However, these can be duplicated easily, and if someone gets your fingerprint file, it's a permanent loss solution. With iris and retinal scan, these have a high accuracy rate, and they are totally unique for each individual user. However, they're very intrusive to the user and very expensive to set up and maintain. And with voice and speech, yes, these are easy for the user to use and hardware is cheap. However, background noise causes problems, and these are easily recordable, so these are easily fakeable. With pros and cons of smart cards, they're very convenient to the end user. They are self-contained security devices. They're inexpensive and very portable. However, these are easily lost and stolen. They have limited encryption options based on the chip size, and you need special equipment such as smart card readers to read the smart cards. With USB devices, these are more secure than traditional username and password combinations. They can hold encryption keys and certificates on the device itself, and they're also very inexpensive and portable. However, users must also carry and possess the USB device with them at all times. These are also easily lost and stolen, and you need multiple keys or certificates for multiple tasks or functions associated with the USB device. However, keep in mind, because of the ease of how it can be deployed as a technology and the non-obtrusive manner in which the data can be collected and compared, facial recognition is currently being used and deployed by military, police, and homeland security throughout the US and the world to track criminals, threats, and other problems, both locally and internationally. The alternative Active Directory authentication system most widely used today, with data that's much too valuable to not keep secure, and tough passwords are simply too much trouble for end users to remember and maintain. As a result, and based on a comparison of the pros and the cons for all of the available alternative authentication methods available, most companies today use a two-factor authentication system that uses a combination of a password plus a 4 to 6 digit PIN number and a USB device with a random code that's new and generated every minute for their logon purposes. The user password is generated based on a recommended Microsoft password policy criteria, and the PIN number is a random number that is unique and memorized by the user, usually 4 to 6 digits in length. The USB device is to be carried by the user and inserted into the workstation as part of the authentication process, and plus the company is protected if the USB is ever lost or stolen. The device cannot be used to access the system without the PIN, since it's required to be granted access to the system. My personal recommendation, if you are considering implementing an alternative authentication method to be used with Active Directory, is to find a system that's based on what you need from the alternative system and how it will achieve your security goals with that new system. However, it's best to implement a system that's going to be easy to integrate with your current system, easy for users to implement and use, is cost effective to install, maintain, and train personnel to use, works across a wide multitude of operating systems, works with multiple devices and mobile applications and devices, allows two-factor authentication, uses a minimal amount of resources, and is secure in itself. Based on my research and data, I would recommend Gold Key Security and implement a two-factor authentication system with a USB and a random PIN and combine that with a password. Several companies today that are at the top of their game for offering alternative solutions for Active Directory authentication using smart cards and USB devices are Gold Key Technology, Cypress Security, CryptoCard Securities, and CyberSafe using Trust Broker. References that were used during the research of this presentation: additional references that were used. Thank you.